The scorching sun beat down on the makeshift hospital tents scattered across the Moroccan desert. Captain James Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he moved between rows of wounded soldiers. The smell of infection and death filled the hot air. It was September 1943, and the North African campaign had left thousands of American soldiers fighting for their lives, not from bullets, but from something far more deadly. Morrison had been a country doctor in Vermont before the war. He joined the Army Medical Corps, thinking he could save lives. Now he watched helplessly as young men died from infected wounds. The real killer was not the enemy. It was the bacteria that invaded every cut, every scratch, every bullet wound. In the desert heat, infections spread like wildfire. The medical situation had become a nightmare. Just 3 weeks ago, a German submarine had torpedoed 2 American supply ships off the coast of Algeria. Those ships carried tons of precious medical supplies. Sulfa drugs, the miracle medicine that fought infections, were now almost gone. Morrison had exactly 12 doses left for over 300 wounded men. He had to choose who lived and who died. The weight of those choices was crushing him. Private Tommy Wilson lay on a cot near the tent entrance. He was only 19 years old. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg during the Battle of Kasserine Pass 2 weeks ago. Morrison had cleaned the wound and stitched it up. But in this heat, with flies everywhere and limited clean water, the infection had taken hold anyway. Tommy's leg had swollen to twice its normal size. Red lines of blood poisoning crept up toward his hip. His fever burned at 104 degrees. Without antibiotics, he had maybe 2 days to live. Morrison had sent 3 urgent requests to command headquarters in Algiers. Each time, the answer came back the same. No supplies available. All antibiotics were being sent to support the invasion of Italy. The Sicily campaign had just ended in August, and now Allied forces were pushing into the Italian mainland. North Africa was considered secure. The wounded men here would have to wait, but Morrison's patients could not wait. Every morning, he made his rounds and found 2 or 3 more dead. The orderlies wrapped the bodies in canvas and buried them in the rocky ground outside the camp. Morrison kept a list of names in his pocket. 27 men had died from infections in the past week alone. Not from combat wounds, but from infections that could have been easily treated with proper medicine. The worst part was watching the soldiers understand their fate. They could see the infected wounds turning black. They could smell the rot setting in. They knew what was coming. Some begged Morrison for help. Others just stared at the tent's ceiling, waiting for the end. A few wrote final letters home, their hands shaking with fever. Lieutenant Davis, Morrison's assistant, had stopped sleeping. Dark circles ringed his eyes. He was 26 years old and had started losing his hair from stress. Together, they tried everything they could think of. They boiled bandages until the fabric fell apart. They cleaned wounds with precious alcohol meant for sterilizing surgical tools. They even tried crushing aspirin tablets into a paste to fight infection. Nothing worked. The local Moroccan people kept their distance from the American camp. They had seen too much war already. First the French colonial forces, then the Germans and Italians, now the Americans. The farmers in the nearby village of Sidi Ibrahim just wanted to be left alone. They had their own problems. The war had disrupted trade routes. Food was scarce. Young men from the village had been forced to fight for various armies. Nobody wanted more trouble. But one old farmer named Hassan watched the American camp from his olive grove on the hillside. He was 72 years old, his face weathered and dark from decades under the desert sun. Hassan had lived through many wars. He remembered when the Ottoman Empire ruled Morocco. He remembered the French taking control. He remembered the Great War from 1914 to 1918, when his own father had helped wounded soldiers. Hassan could see the smoke from the American camp's cremation fires. He knew what that meant. Men were dying in large numbers. His heart felt heavy. War was war, but watching young men die needlessly bothered him. His grandfather had been a healer, treating wounds with old methods passed down through generations. Hassan knew things that modern doctors had forgotten. Every evening, Hassan tended his beehives in the grove. He had 20 hives producing rich, dark honey. This was not ordinary honey. The bees fed on wild thyme, rosemary, and eucalyptus flowers that grew in the mountains. The honey was thick, almost black, and had a sharp, medicinal taste. Hassan's grandfather had used this honey to treat wounds during the Great War. He had saved lives when doctors had nothing else to offer. Hassan debated with himself for days. Should he approach the Americans? They might not listen to an old Moroccan farmer. They had their modern medicine and educated doctors. Why would they trust ancient desert remedies? But the smoke from the cremation fires kept rising. More young men kept dying. Finally, Hassan made his decision. He would try to help, even if they thought him foolish. Morrison stood outside the hospital tent as the sun set over the Atlas Mountains. The evening air brought no relief from the heat. Tomorrow, he would have to decide which soldiers would get the last few doses of medicine. It was an impossible choice. He looked at the list of names in his hand and felt like he was signing death warrants. He did not know that everything was about to change. An old farmer with a jar of honey was walking down from the hills, carrying a solution that would save thousands of lives and change military medicine forever. The morning market in Sidi Brahim buzzed with quiet activity. Moroccan merchants sold vegetables, dried figs, and flatbread under makeshift canopies. Captain Morrison walked through the narrow streets, drawing curious stares from locals. He wore civilian clothes borrowed from a supply sergeant, hoping to blend in better. The army had forbidden soldiers from entering local villages without permission, but Morrison was desperate. He needed to find any kind of medicine, any kind of help. 3 days had passed since Private Tommy Wilson died. The infection had spread to his blood, and he had passed away, screaming in pain. Morrison had held the young man's hand until the end. Now 14 more soldiers were showing the same symptoms. Red lines of blood poisoning, high fevers, wounds that smelled like death. Morrison had used his last dose of sulfa drugs yesterday. He was completely out of options. The village elder, a thin man with a gray beard, had refused to meet with him. Through an interpreter, the message came back clear. The village wanted nothing to do with military affairs. They had their own sick to care for. They had their own problems. Morrison could not blame them. The war had brought nothing but suffering to North Africa. German and Italian forces had occupied Tunisia and Libya for years. The battles between Axis and Allied forces had destroyed farms, killed civilians, and disrupted ancient trade routes that had existed for centuries. Morrison stopped at a small stall selling oranges. He bought 3, paying with American dollars that the merchant eyed suspiciously. As he peeled one of the oranges, an old man approached him. The man wore traditional Moroccan robes and a white turban. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. The old man spoke in broken English. His accent was thick, but Morrison could understand him. Years ago, the man explained, he had worked for French colonial officers and had learned some English from British soldiers during the Great War. His name was Hassan, and he had been watching the American camp from his olive grove. Morrison felt embarrassed. He started to explain that he was just a tourist, not a soldier, but Hassan held up his hand and smiled. The old farmer was not fooled. He could see the concern in Morrison's eyes, the exhaustion in his face. He knew this was a doctor who was losing patience. Hassan reached into a cloth bag and pulled out a glass jar. Inside was dark, thick honey that looked almost black in the sunlight. He held out to Morrison and said something in Arabic, then switched to English. Medicine for wounds. Very old medicine. His grandfather used it in the last war. It saved many soldiers. Morrison stared at the jar. Honey? For infected wounds? He had studied medicine at Harvard University. He knew about bacteria, about sterile procedures, about modern antibiotics. Putting honey on an infected wound went against everything he had learned. It seemed absurd, even dangerous. Honey was food, not medicine. Sugar would feed bacteria, not kill it. But Hassan was persistent. He rolled up his sleeve and showed Morrison a long scar on his forearm. 10 years ago, he explained, a plow blade had torn through his arm. The wound had become infected. The local doctor said he might lose the arm. Hassan's wife had packed the wound with this special honey. Within days, the infection cleared. The wound healed perfectly. Morrison studied the scar. It was clean, with no signs of the complications that usually came from severe infections. No dead tissue, no discoloration. Just a thin white line on dark skin. He looked at the jar of honey again. What did he have to lose? His patients were dying anyway. Modern medicine had abandoned them. Maybe ancient wisdom could help where science had failed. Hassan seemed to read his thoughts. He explained that this was not regular honey. His bees fed on specific flowers in the mountains. Wild thyme, eucalyptus, and desert lavender. The honey had special properties. It fought infection. It kept wounds clean. It helped healing. His grandfather had learned this from his grandfather, knowledge passed down through many generations. Morrison made a decision. He bought the jar of honey and 3 more that Hassan said he could provide. The old farmer refused payment at first, but Morrison insisted. If this worked, he would need much more honey. Hassan nodded slowly. He understood. He said he could bring more honey tomorrow. He could also teach Morrison and his medical staff the proper way to use it. When Morrison returned to camp, Lieutenant Davis saw the jars of honey and laughed bitterly. Had the captain gone crazy from stress? Were they going to feed honey to dying soldiers now? Other medical staff gathered around, making jokes. Honey therapy. What would headquarters think of that? Morrison would probably lose his commission for trying such nonsense. But Morrison did not care anymore about his commission or what anyone thought. He had watched too many young men die. That evening, he selected 3 soldiers with the worst infections. All 3 were expected to die within 48 hours. Their wounds had turned black. Fever burned through their bodies. They drifted in and out of consciousness. Morrison cleaned each wound carefully, using the last of his sterile water. Then, following Hassan's instructions that he had scribbled on a piece of paper, he packed the wounds with the thick, dark honey. He covered them with clean bandages. The other medical staff watched in silence. Some shook their heads. Some prayed. All of them thought Morrison had finally broken under the pressure. The first night, nothing changed. The 3 soldiers remained feverish, groaning in pain. Morrison sat by their cots, checking on them every hour. By morning, he felt foolish. The honey idea was stupid. He had wasted time on a folk remedy when he should have been preparing these men for the end. But on the second day, something strange began to happen. One of the soldiers, a corporal from Texas named Jack Reed, opened his eyes and asked for water. His fever had dropped. Morrison checked the wound. The black tissue looked less severe. Was it his imagination? By evening, Reed's temperature had fallen to 101 degrees. Still high, but better than the 105 it had been on the 3rd day. All 3 soldiers showed improvement. The infections were visibly shrinking. The red lines of blood poisoning had stopped spreading. Morrison could not believe what he was seeing. He called Lieutenant Davis over to confirm he was not hallucinating. Davis stared at the wounds in shock. Something was actually working. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. The captain had found a miracle cure. Soldiers who had been preparing to die suddenly had hope. Hassan arrived at the American camp on the 4th day, carrying 6 more jars of honey. The guards at the entrance wanted to turn him away, but Captain Morrison rushed out to meet him. The old farmer smiled when he saw the relief on Morrison's face. The honey was working. Hassan knew it would. His grandfather's wisdom had never failed. Morrison led Hassan through the hospital tent. The 3 soldiers treated with honey were sitting up, eating breakfast. Their wounds, which had been black and rotting 5 days ago, now showed healthy, pink tissue. The infections had cleared. Corporal Jack Reed even managed to joke with the nurses. He said he would write home and tell his mother that honey had saved his life. She would never believe it. Lieutenant Davis had spent the previous night documenting everything in detailed medical notes. As a trained physician, he needed to understand what was happening. He had examined the honey under a microscope from the camp laboratory. The thick substance contained something that killed bacteria. Davis did not know exactly what it was, but he could see dead bacterial cells floating in samples mixed with the honey. Years later, scientists would discover that honey contains hydrogen peroxide, low pH levels, and special enzymes that create a hostile environment for bacteria. The thick consistency also seals wounds from air and prevents new bacteria from entering. Some types of honey, especially from bees that feed on certain flowers, have even stronger antibacterial properties. But in 1943, Morrison and Davis only knew one thing. The honey worked when nothing else did. By the end of the week, Morrison had treated 27 soldiers with Hassan's honey. 23 showed dramatic improvement. 4 had infections too severe to save, but they died more peacefully, with less pain than before. The honey seemed to have some pain-relieving properties too. Soldiers reported that the burning sensation in their wounds decreased after honey treatment. The success could not be kept quiet. Other medical officers from nearby camps heard the stories and came to investigate. Major Richardson from the 34th Infantry Division arrived with deep skepticism. He had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School and considered himself a man of science. Honey therapy sounded like medieval superstition. But when Morrison showed him the recovered patients and Davis's detailed medical notes, Richardson's skepticism faded. Richardson had 42 soldiers in his camp with infected wounds. Supplies were equally desperate at his location. He asked Morrison to share the honey and the treatment protocol. Morrison agreed immediately, but there was a problem. Hassan only had so many beehives. His small farm could not produce enough honey for hundreds of wounded soldiers across multiple camps. Hassan listened to the problem through an interpreter that Morrison had hired from the village. The old farmer nodded thoughtfully. He said there were other beekeepers in the region. His cousin in the next village kept 30 hives. His brother-in-law in the mountains had 50 hives. If the Americans needed honey for medicine, the local farming communities could work together to provide it. But Hassan had one condition. The Americans must pay fair prices for the honey. The war had destroyed the normal markets for honey. Beekeepers were struggling to survive. If the military wanted their honey, they must pay enough so the farmers could feed their families. Morrison agreed without hesitation. He would find the money somehow. The Army supply system moved slowly, but Morrison knew a colonel in the Quartermaster Corps who owed him a favor. 2 years ago, Morrison had saved the colonel's son from a burst appendix. One telegram later, Morrison had authorization to purchase up to 500 pounds of honey for medical purposes. The authorization came with questions and requirements for detailed reporting, but it came through. Hassan organized the beekeepers. Within 3 weeks, a network of farms across northern Morocco was producing honey for the American military. The farmers delivered jars to Hassan's farm, and Hassan's sons transported them to various military camps using donkey carts. It was not a sophisticated supply chain, but it worked. The official Army report from October 1943 showed remarkable statistics. Infection mortality rates in camps using honey therapy dropped from 37% to 8%. Soldiers recovered faster and returned to duty sooner. The honey treatment cost a fraction of what sulfa drugs cost, and it was readily available from local sources. News of the honey therapy reached General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in North Africa was dealing with massive challenges. The invasion of Italy was consuming enormous resources. American forces were preparing for the eventual invasion of France. Every soldier mattered. Anything that could keep more soldiers alive and combat-ready deserved attention. Eisenhower ordered a full medical investigation. Army doctors from the Medical Corps Research Division arrived in Morocco to study the honey treatment. They were led by Colonel Dr. Edward Thompson, a stern man who had served in World War I. Thompson had seen plenty of miracle cures that turned out to be worthless. He expected honey therapy to be another false hope. But Thompson was an honest scientist. He spent 2 weeks examining patients, reviewing medical records, and conducting controlled experiments. He treated one group of infected wounds with honey and another group with the best conventional methods available. The honey group recovered faster with fewer complications. The evidence was undeniable. Thompson wrote a detailed report recommending that honey therapy be added to official Army medical protocols. The report noted that while sulfa drugs were superior when available, honey provided an excellent alternative when antibiotics were scarce or unavailable. He also noted that honey seemed particularly effective against certain types of infections that did not respond well to sulfa drugs. The report created controversy in military medical circles. Some doctors refused to believe that a simple folk remedy could match modern medicine. They accused Thompson of poor research methods or of being fooled by coincidence. But doctors in the field, the ones actually treating wounded soldiers, embraced the honey therapy enthusiastically. They had seen it work with their own eyes. WWII December 1943, honey had become standard issue in medical kits across North Africa. Medics carried small tins of honey alongside their bandages and morphine. Field hospitals stocked jars of honey in their supply rooms. The army had contracted with over 200 beekeepers across Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia to provide medical-grade honey. Hassan became a regular visitor to military camps. He taught medics the proper way to apply honey to different types of wounds. Clean the wound first. Pack it generously with honey. Change the dressing daily. Keep the wound covered. Simple instructions that saved countless lives. Private soldiers began calling it Hassan's miracle. Officers referred to it as the honey protocol. Whatever they called it, the result was the same. Thousands of soldiers who would have died from infections now survived. January 1944 brought freezing rain to the mountains of Italy. American soldiers fought through mud and ice as they pushed north toward Rome. The Battle of Monte Cassino had begun, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. Thousands of soldiers fell wounded in the rocky terrain. Medical supplies struggled to reach the front lines through destroyed roads and enemy fire. Captain James Morrison had been transferred to Italy in late December. His success with honey therapy in North Africa had earned him a promotion and a new assignment. The Army wanted him to implement the honey protocol across all Mediterranean medical operations. It was an enormous task, but Morrison threw himself into it with determination. The challenge in Italy was different from North Africa. The cold, wet conditions created different types of infections. Trench foot plagued soldiers who spent days in waterlogged foxholes. Frostbite complicated wounds. Pneumonia killed as many men as bullets. Morrison needed to adapt the honey treatment to these new conditions that he worked with Italian beekeepers who had somehow kept their hives alive through years of war. Italian honey was different from Moroccan honey. The bees fed on acacia flowers, chestnut trees, and wildflowers in the Alps. But the antibacterial properties remained strong. Tests showed that Italian honey worked just as well as the North African variety. WWII February 1944. The honey protocol had spread to every Allied field hospital in Italy. Military trains carried crates of honey jars alongside ammunition and food supplies. Each jar was labeled with instructions in English and Italian. Medical officers reported that infection rates continued to drop. The honey was saving lives in the frozen mountains just as it had in the desert. But the real test came in June 1944 with Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. On June 6th, over 150,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of France. The fighting was brutal. Thousands fell wounded in the first hours. Medics worked frantically under enemy fire, trying to keep soldiers alive long enough to reach field hospitals. The invasion planners had learned from North Africa and Italy. Every medic who landed on D-Day carried honey in their medical kit. Every field hospital ship was stocked with cases of honey. The Quartermaster Corps had arranged contracts with beekeepers across England to ensure adequate supply. Nobody wanted to repeat the desperate shortages that had killed so many in North Africa. Sergeant Mike Collins landed on Omaha Beach in the second wave. German machine guns tore through his unit. A bullet ripped through his shoulder, and shrapnel from a mortar shell shredded his leg. He collapsed in the bloody sand, certain he would die. A medic named Danny Ortega crawled to him under heavy fire. Ortega cleaned the wounds as best he could, packed them with honey from a small tin, and wrapped them tight. Collins survived the beach and was evacuated to a hospital ship by evening. The ship's doctors examined his wounds and were amazed. Despite being packed with sand and seawater for hours, the wounds showed no signs of serious infection. The honey had protected them. Collins would spend months recovering, but he kept his leg and his life. Stories like Collins spread through the invasion force. Soldiers who had been skeptical about honey therapy became believers. By the end of June, field hospitals in Normandy were treating over 5,000 wounded men daily. The honey supply held up, and infection rates remained manageable despite the massive casualties. The success caught the attention of the British Medical Corps. British doctors have been watching the American honey therapy with interest. Now they began implementing it in their own hospitals. Canadian and Free French forces followed. By August 1944, the honey protocol had become standard practice across all Allied forces in Western Europe. Hassan, still in Morocco, received letters from soldiers he had never met. They wrote to thank him for teaching the Americans about honey. Some sent photographs of themselves recovered and healthy. Others sent small gifts. One soldier sent a Bronze Star medal, saying Hassan deserved it more than he did. Hassan kept the letters in a wooden box and read them to his grandchildren. The German forces eventually learned about the Allied honey therapy. Intelligence reports noted that American soldiers carried honey in their medical kits. German doctors were initially dismissive, considering it primitive and unscientific. But as the war turned against Germany and their own medical supplies dwindled, some German medics began experimenting with honey therapy themselves. A captured German medical officer told interrogators in late 1944 that honey had kept his soldiers alive when they had no antibiotics left. He asked if the Allies would share their honey supply protocols. The request was denied, but it showed how desperate the situation had become for German forces. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the United States military had purchased over 8 million pounds of honey for medical purposes. The honey had been sourced from beekeepers in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Italy, France, England, and even liberated areas of Germany. The supply chain stretched across 3 continents and involved thousands of farming families. Military statisticians attempted to calculate how many lives the honey therapy had saved. The numbers were difficult to determine precisely, but estimates ranged from 50,000 to over 100,000 soldiers. These were men who would have died from infected wounds if they had only had access to the limited supplies of antibiotics. The cost savings were equally impressive. Honey purchased from local beekeepers cost a fraction of what imported sulfa drugs cost. The Army Surgeon General estimated that the honey protocol had saved over $40 million in medical expenses. More importantly, it had kept experienced soldiers alive and, in the fight, contributing to the Allied victory. Captain Morrison, now a major, found himself giving lectures at military medical schools about the honey therapy. He told the story of Hassan, the Moroccan farmer who had walked down from his olive grove with a jar of dark honey. He emphasized that modern medicine did not have all the answers. Sometimes ancient wisdom, passed down through generations, contained truth that science had forgotten or never known. The pharmaceutical companies were less enthusiastic. They had invested heavily in developing new antibiotics and saw honey therapy as competition. Some lobbied against its use, arguing that it was unscientific and unreliable. But the military doctors who had used honey in the field knew better. They had seen it work when nothing else was available. In the Pacific Theater, honey therapy faced different challenges. The tropical climate and different types of infections required adjustments to the protocol. But American forces implemented it there too, working with beekeepers in Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines. By war's end, honey therapy had been used on every continent where American soldiers fought. Hassan never traveled beyond Morocco, but his influence reached across the world. A simple farmer with traditional knowledge had changed military medicine forever. His stupid trick, as some had called it, had proven smarter than modern science in a time of desperate need. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. Millions of soldiers returned home to begin new lives. They carried memories of battles, lost friends, and moments of terror. Some also carried small tins of honey, souvenirs from a therapy that had saved their lives or the lives of their buddies. Major James Morrison returned to Vermont in October 1945. He was 42 years old and had aged 20 years during the war. The nightmares came every night, memories of soldiers he could not save. But he also remembered the ones he had saved with honey. That memory gave him peace. Morrison reopened his medical practice in Burlington. He continued using honey therapy for infected wounds in his civilian patients. Other doctors thought he was eccentric, still using a wartime field remedy when modern antibiotics were now widely available. But Morrison knew that antibiotics did not work for every infection. Some bacteria were already developing resistance. Honey remained effective when drugs failed. He wrote letters to Hassan in Morocco. The letters took weeks to arrive, carried by slow postal ships across the Atlantic. Hassan's son Ahmed, who had learned English from American soldiers, read the letters to his father. Hassan always smiled when he heard Morrison's news. The two men had formed an unlikely friendship across cultures and continents. In 1947, Morrison published a paper in the Journal of Military Medicine titled Honey Therapy in Combat Wound Management. The paper documented his experiences in North Africa, Italy, and France. It included detailed statistics, medical protocols, and recommendations for future use. The paper was controversial. Many doctors still viewed honey therapy as unscientific folk medicine, but Morrison's reputation as a combat surgeon gave him credibility. He had treated thousands of wounded soldiers under impossible conditions. He had seen what worked and what had not. His paper became required reading at military medical schools. The Army officially adopted honey therapy as an alternative treatment for wound infections when antibiotics were unavailable or ineffective. The post-war years brought enormous changes to medicine. Penicillin became widely available to civilians. New antibiotics were discovered and manufactured. Modern medicine seemed to have conquered bacterial infections. Honey therapy faded from mainstream medical practice. It became a historical footnote, something doctors learn about in medical history classes but never actually used. Hassan continued farming his olive grove and tending his beehives. The war had brought brief prosperity to his family. The American military had paid well for his honey. He had used the money to buy more land, build a better house, and send his sons to school in Casablanca. But Hassan never forgot why the Americans had needed his honey. War was waste. War was death. He hoped humanity would learn to stop killing itself. In 1952, a group of American veterans organized a trip to Morocco. 27 men who had been treated with honey therapy wanted to meet Hassan and thank him personally. They saved their money for over a year to afford the journey. In May, they arrived at the small village of Sidi Brahim. Hassan was 79 years old then, his hair completely white, his back bent from decades of farm work. But his mind remained sharp and his heart warm. When the Americans arrived at his farm, he wept. He had never expected to see the results of his help, to meet the living men whose lives his honey had saved. The veterans spent 3 days in Sidi Brahim. They shared meals with Hassan's family, told stories of the war, and visited the olive grove where Hassan's beehives still hummed with activity. They erected a simple stone marker on Hassan's property with an inscription in English and Arabic. In gratitude to Hassan ibn Muhammad, whose wisdom saved thousands of Allied soldiers. 1943 to 1945. Photographs from that visit show Hassan surrounded by smiling American men, all of them laughing and embracing like old friends. One photo, taken by a French journalist, appeared in Life magazine with the headline, "The Farmer Who Saved an Army." The article told Hassan's story to millions of readers worldwide. Hassan died peacefully in his sleep in November 1967 at the age of 94. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including 2 American veterans who had maintained contact with his family. The Moroccan government declared him a national hero. The American embassy sent representatives and a letter of commendation from President Lyndon Johnson. Morrison continued his medical practice until 1970, when he retired at age 67. He had trained dozens of young doctors and always taught them about honey therapy. Never dismiss traditional knowledge, he told his students. Modern science does not have all the answers. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful. Morrison died in 1978 at age 75. His obituary in the New England Journal of Medicine mentioned his pioneering work with honey therapy during World War II. The obituary noted that Morrison's research had inspired renewed scientific interest in honey's medical properties. By the 1980s, medical researchers were rediscovering what Hassan's grandfather had known a century earlier. Scientific studies proved that honey had powerful antibacterial properties. Medical-grade honey began appearing in hospital supply rooms. Burn units used honey-based dressings. Surgeons applied honey to difficult wounds that resisted conventional treatment. In 1999, New Zealand researchers discovered that Manuka honey from tea tree flowers had exceptional antibacterial properties. The honey could kill antibiotic-resistant bacteria, including MRSA, a deadly infection that plagued hospitals worldwide. The discovery led to widespread commercial production of medical honey products. Modern military forces once again carried honey in their medical kits. American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan used honey therapy for blast wounds and burns. The wheel had turned full circle. Ancient wisdom, forgotten by modern medicine, had been rediscovered and validated by science. In 2010, the United States Army Medical Corps established the Hassan I.B. Muhammad Award for Innovation in Field Medicine. The award honored medical personnel who found creative solutions to save lives in combat conditions. The first recipient was a Navy corpsman who had used honey to treat infected wounds in a remote Afghan village where no antibiotics were available. Hassan's farm in Morocco became a historical site. Tourists and military historians visited to see where the honey therapy had originated. Hassan's grandson, also named Hassan, continued keeping bees using the same methods his grandfather had taught him. He produced honey for both food and medical purposes, exporting to hospitals across Europe. In 2015, a monument was unveiled in Burlington, Vermont, near where Morrison had practiced medicine. The bronze statue showed a soldier and a farmer shaking hands, a jar of honey between them. The inscription read, "In memory of Major James Morrison and Hassan Ibn Muhammad, who proved that wisdom transcends borders and that sometimes the simplest answers save the most lives." Today, medical honey is a standard treatment in advanced hospitals worldwide. Research continues into its properties and applications. Scientists have discovered that honey fights bacteria through multiple mechanisms, making it difficult for bacteria to develop resistance. It remains effective when antibiotics fail. The story of Hassan and Morrison is taught in military medical schools as a lesson in keeping an open mind. War creates desperate situations that require creative solutions. The wisdom to accept help from unexpected sources can mean the difference between life and death. Thousands of World War II veterans live long lives because a Moroccan farmer walked down from his olive grove with a jar of honey. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren exist because Hassan chose to share his knowledge. The ripple effects of one act of compassion spread across generations. The stupid trick that everyone mocked became one of the war's most important medical innovations. It saved an estimated 50 to 100,000 lives and influenced military medicine for the next 80 years. Hassan never sought fame or recognition. He simply wanted to help suffering people. In doing so, he changed history.